Welcome to True North Project, a podcast that's equal parts sense-making, soul-searching, and storytelling. I'm your host, Christian. Jonny Miller is the host of the Curious Humans podcast, the creator of the Nervous System Mastery course, and a fellow explorer. In this episode, we delve into topics such as how our education system may be stifling curiosity, the concept of live playership, and the importance of recognizing our uniqueness, psychedelics becoming mainstream, and how to create the right cultural container for these potent molecules, the need for ethical culture to address our societal intimacy disorder, the role of artificial intelligence and the importance of discernment in navigating our increasingly digital world, and Jonny's experiences with breathwork and its transformative potential. This episode is a deep dive into intimacy, localization, and regeneration. I had a ton of fun, dropping in with Jonny, and hope you enjoy it as much as I did. And if you identify as a curious human, check out the Curious Humans podcast. If you'd like to train with Jonny, the next cohort of Nervous System Mastery runs from March 25th to April 26th. Much love. Yeah, and I'm going to take a rip off of this, which is my friend Danton makes that. He's a chemist, and he's been in the cannabis industry for a long time.
Okay.
So he made this custom combination of cannabinoids, which I find to be particularly fruitful in conversation.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Nice.
If it works. You're welcome to it if you like.
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Okay. So I'll leave it right here.
Yeah. Wait for the plane the helicopter to.
Yeah, you can't wait for the world. World's not going to stop for us. There's probably a fire. I mean, I would imagine there's been some pretty rough air quality today.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, just like a lot of haze.
Yeah,
and there's an air quality
yeah.
mention or warning or whatever on the weather.
Okay.
So, Jonny, you've got a cool podcast. I like it a lot. It's called Curious Humans. I resonated with it because I self-identify as a curious human. Yeah. And so speak to me a little bit about why curiosity is the main theme or meme that you chose for that project, and how curiosity is factored into your life.
Yeah, beautiful. What a great starting point. And I also love that we're recording this outside. Like I've only ever done one episode before outside, and there's something beautiful about being under a tree with like birds and butterflies out here.
Looking down a beautiful canyon. It's a great spot.
Yeah, it definitely inspires curiosity, I think.
100%.
Why is curiosity important to me? Well, I think I've always been someone who, like, I've always asked a lot of questions, and when I was at school, I think it came through in quite like a kinked, kind of maybe shadowy way, where I was just questioning, like, why am I here? What's the point of all of this? Like, why are we learning this? You know, all that kind of stuff. But I think I've always been someone who has, like, enjoyed stretching my imagination in different ways. And I think when I was younger, the curiosity was kind of funneled into, like, video games, fantasy books, these kinds of things. And then when I left school, I did a trip around the world, and I became fascinated by travel and exploring other cultures, seeing the world through these different cultural lenses. And then I think in more recent years, that curiosity has kind of been turned more inwards into kind of one's inner landscape and into the kind of interior sciences. But for me, curiosity is, I think it's the birthplace of creativity. I think it's the beginning. It's like the spark that ignites the fires of passion. I think it's very hard to be both depressed or angry at the same time as you're curious. So for me, almost on like a practical level, if I find myself like shut down or frustrated by something, my puppy's quite curious about this bone right here. I think asking the question, just changing the lens to see how I can be curious about something, it's a very effective tool for changing my state as well. And And it leads to great conversations in great places. And I think all of the best decisions of my life have been in some way fueled by curiosity, even though I've not known quite how it will end up. But there's like a feeling that I'm trusting, which usually leads to great conversations, great people, adventures, and those kinds of things.
Yeah. You mentioned school and this sort of shadow side of curiosity, and I think there's worth double clicking on that, just because I think there's something wrong kind of fundamentally with sort of, I guess, the way that mainstream education happens, in the sense that it's not inspiring curiosity, and it seems to do something to a person's curiosity where it almost atrophies.
Yep.
And is repressed in some kind of fundamental way. And so, you might, the expression of that as somebody who, say, was curious, or as a curious person inside, can often be like either, some sort of resentment or anger or frustration. This is all just stupid or a waste of my time, or it's procrastination. It's those kind of things where you just sort of like, it's almost like a rebellion against something because deep down, something's kind of off or wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's what a lot of, adolescence for me was, and going through school and whatnot. Like, it was, I figured out, so my curiosity in school was sort of like, I would say, definitely minimized and somewhat squashed right around third grade. And to know, and I don't blame that on like particular humans or teachers, right? Like, I think they all had definitely my best interests in their heart. A lot of them had huge hearts, had some amazing women in particular that were teachers that, tons of care, right? But at the same time, they're byproducts of a system, and they're following a curriculum, and they're just doing their thing, right? And so it was about third grade, I think, that I started to lose my sense of wonder and curiosity about the world, and where I felt like the questions didn't have answers. I got kind of dead-ended, and I stopped asking the deeper questions in some ways. And then I kind of got, I guess, domesticated or sort of accustomed to this system and the way that it is, and I got good at playing the game. And so I was just like, I can, do the minimum effective dose, whatever is required to pass and to get through school, but then, I'll just fuck off and I'll go drink with my friends, and like that instead, instead of putting it, like, being really engaged with it. So, there's something about like curiosity as a doorway into really just fundamentally learning, right? And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, as you've gone through sort of, I don't know if you've been to like university. Okay, so you've done like, school through that kind of way, and then you've done sort of school of life, like travel, experience, podcasting, entrepreneurship, all that, right? Yeah. And so, what would you say are the different kind of are those two things fundamentally different in how you learn? And is curiosity, did it play the same role in both?
Yeah, great question. I think the answer is they're very different, but ultimately they should be more the same. Like, I view education broadly as actually, it's like, how do you pour fuel on the fire of someone's existing curiosity? I think that really should be the objective of mainstream education. And as you said, it's kind of the opposite, where we get rewarded for giving the correct answers on tests, as opposed to asking interesting questions and following that aliveness. And so I think for me, it really wasn't until I left school that I felt empowered and even, had the opportunity and the time to follow my own curiosity, because it quite broadly, although I also had some great teachers, it was very geared towards like consuming and extracting as much information as possible, cramming it into my mind, and then like basically puking it out for exams. Like, that's basically what the education model was. And so I think,
I say it still is.
Yeah,
generally.
Sure. I mean, I haven't really followed what's what's happened since. I know there've been some changes since COVID, and I know there are some other, like Montessori, Waldorf schools which are taking a different approach. But I'm speaking from kind of a a traditional British public school upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
And university was a little bit better. I think I enjoyed, in my final year, I got to do a dissertation, and that gave me a lot more freedom, where I got to pick the thesis and the question that I was curious about. And I ended up getting the best mark in the year, because it was like I really got to go deep in something that mattered to me.
Yeah.
But I think since then it's been, I mean, sometimes I think about the question of like, if I was to design a self-guided curriculum for a year or 2 years, what would be on that? Like, what are some of the skills which weren't taught in school, which I've kind of had to learn through reading books, through meeting people, through retreats, those kinds of things, which actually have had a much bigger impact in my life than, you know, much of the stuff that was taught in my teenage years.
Yeah, it's like this distinction between intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation.
Definitely, yeah.
And I would say curiosity is inherently an intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
It's like you just want to know, or you know, there's something driving you that's inside,
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of autopoetic in a way.
Yep.
Right. So yeah, it's interesting. Like you've had Zach Stein on your podcast, and
Mm-hmm.
he's, you know, one of the more lucid people I've ever found speaking about education and learning. And I think he's a philosopher of education.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like, you know, if we're to, and now we're kind of, I'm making a leap here, but like, it seems like if we're going to make the leap towards something like the infinite game, or, you know, some sort of more beautiful world, or something where we're not like in a dumpster fire, or some sort of like, you know, train running off the cliff without any brakes. Kind of like all the metaphors you could use describing sort of the meta crisis moment of current the Anthropocene and modern man, you know, which we can tease apart if you want, but like that whole thing, if we're gonna sort of like pivot in some sort of way and avoid that, or correct course, then education seems like it has to be like right at the center of the revolution. And what I mean by that is like how we take young, you know, undomesticated, wild, full of life humans, right, that come into the world, and how those make it to, you know, adults in the society. Like, what is that process like? And what are the rites of passage? And what is the transfer of wisdom and knowledge, and how does that go, and how does that look, and what kind of people are on the other side of that transition of growing up, right? And I think that if you look at like sort of the current model, the current way we're doing it, it's sort of like just a copy paste of a culture onto people in a way that's very conformist. Like it kind of encourages conformity, and people to conform to sort of social norms and pressures and market pressures, right? Like, I'm going to go chase this degree because it's the one that'll get me a good job, right? And so you're making a decision fundamentally on the basis of, say, economics versus or financial whatever versus curiosity, or versus something that you've got like a more of an intrinsic passion for, or something like that. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but just the idea of you know, having a podcast around curiosity, which I think is synonymous with learning, and also synonymous with innovation. And you know, if we're going to find our way out of this pickle, then curiosity is going to be super important, right? So curious, like, if you have any thoughts on that, of how, you know, you think about maybe catalyzing a wave of curious culture or something like that. Is it? I mean, you're doing it with your podcast, but if you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, that's really beautifully articulated. The thing that comes to mind for me is that in order to follow your curiosity, it requires kind of trusting in the process and not being attached to the end result. Because oftentimes, you know, you'll come up with a bunch of dead ends, and it might not be efficient or productive in the short term to kind of follow your curiosity. So in a world where we view mankind as basically as almost like machines and tools of producing things, which is kind of what the modern day economic model suggests, if we can shift that to a world where every human has like a unique gift to give, And maybe the purpose of education is to help them tease out what that unique contribution, that unique puzzle piece is, so that they can do it more fully. And as you said, I think that involves a completely different, just like reimagining of what education even is, where it's more about creating these rites of passage and invitations for someone to be more fully themselves, which is essentially the opposite of what's happening, where we're being narrowed down into these like copy and paste humans to fit into factory style corporations to just produce more output. And I think the cultural shifts to create that, the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, it requires honoring everyone's uniqueness and the fact that everyone's curiosity will likely lead them in a different direction. I love the Greek conception of the daemon, and how we have these like kind of inner whispers that bring us towards our life purpose and our gifts.
Which is distinct from demon. Right? Just to clarify.
Yeah.
Similar but different.
Maybe the daemon has been demonized.
Yeah, exactly. But what I mean is like what most people think of it, the term demon. And daemon, I think, is actually spelled
D-A-I-M-O-N, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
So speak to that a little bit more. So it's like kind of like an inner curiosity voice, like if you were to put it to a character or something.
Yeah, I think it really is. And often it will come through as like kind of much more subtle whispers or like gut feelings and intuitions, as opposed to the kind of loud voice in your head, which might be coming from wounding or cultural conditioning, things like that. It's usually a much quieter kind of knowing sense. And I really think that it is a type of curiosity, and if that curiosity is followed enough, it often will lead to wonder and awe and rapture and these kind of larger experiences as well.
Yeah, or to failure, right? Which is how you learn.
Yeah,
totally.
Totally.
And I think there's something implicit in curiosity as well, which is the acknowledgement of ignorance, right? Like to be curious of something is to not know, right? It's to have the
humility.
Yeah, exactly. There's a humility there that it's like, oh yeah, I'm curious because I want more of the story. I don't quite get it, or I think there's more here that I haven't quite uncovered yet. So I think that people who have it all figured out, right? People who've got, so for example, like if you were to take, say, pre-printing press Europe or something, and, 500 years ago, you've got a society of people where like, truth comes from a particular source, like all truth. Like it's coming from a particular book, actually, that's been kind of curated by particular men in positions of power, for a particular means, namely ruling an empire, right? The Roman one in this case, right? So it's like you've got like truth coming from a source. There's certain gatekeepers that get to actually relay the truth and read the Latin and speak the language of the truth, whereas the layman man definitely isn't allowed to interpret the good book, right? So there's a whole chasm between truth and the gatekeepers, and then sort of like the ordinary person. And then the printing press plus scientific method utterly revolutionizes all that, and you're like, oh, now we can actually proliferate information and distribute it broadly, pretty cheap, and just print books. And anyone can read, and we'll go on an inquiry to find out what is, instead of saying everything we already know what is because it's all mapped here in this text, right? So now you fundamentally acknowledge ignorance. You have to acknowledge that you don't know, and that's the whole point of Socrates, that's the whole point of the scientific method, is to say, I don't know, but I wonder what if, And so, like, I think that, I think even now today in 2023, that type of ideological thinking, whatever you want to call it, when you're in your own sort of bubble, your own sort of worldview, where you've optimized for certainty, right? And so you've gravitated towards these stories which provide you with certainty, and they kill curiosity, right? And then you surround yourself with the people who are also in similar, like-minded frames, and then you create these sort of like stagnant, these sort of stagnant societies where there's no new flow of information, knowledge, wisdom, new, trying out anything new. It's really just like we gather together and we regurgitate the same shit. We sing from the same hymn book or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Which there's some good in gathering, of course, but but to the degree that it stifles any curious thinking under the guise of heresy, right? Like in the case of the church, it's like any idea outside of this sort of narrow set is actually heretical, and by the way, can be punishable by some horrific death that we deem necessary, right? So it's kind of fucked up what we're coming out of, historically. But it's been a big part of my path, just because I grew up in a place where there's still this ideological thinking, not in the sense that they'll burn people at the stake, but it's kind of it's along the same lines. It's cut from the same cloth. It's definitely there's this term beyond the pale, right? Like there's the fence of like, okay, everything inside the fence is good, and we'll call that Mormonism or whatever. And then there's like all the other ideas, which are just the devil trying to tempt you or whatever. Right?
Yeah.
So I think there's, it's interesting to see, like, I mean, just coming from a community where like most of the people I grew up with are still there, and they're, a lot of them are very much I wouldn't say their most curious selves, So I don't know if I was going anywhere with a particular question, but I guess now that I'm talking about it, what has your experience been with, like, encountering those types of people in the world, whether it's through business or religion or whatever, where people are just like completely stuck in sort of like a legacy way of seeing the world and thinking, and who aren't open, like, and is it, kind of like a goal or a task that you're seeking out to sort of crack people open with curiosity?
Yeah, so much there.
Sorry, I'll try to shorten those up and kind of like ramble a bit.
No, it's great. It's great. There's so much. I don't know what that sound was.
It's an interesting, like, I think it's a
bug,
some sort of insect. That is a very interesting one.
There we go. So what first came to mind was, I think, the piece around certainty and how actually for a lot of people it's very uncomfortable to be in a place where there is a lack of certainty. And if you don't have a kind of a foundational, like, embodied safety, if you don't feel safe in your body and in the world, having uncertainty, particularly around like the big existential questions, is more destabilizing than they have capacity for. And so I do have a lot of, I guess, like, empathy and compassion for people in those spaces. And you really, in some ways, it's a privilege to have the spaciousness to be curious, because it implies that you can, like, quote unquote, waste time. You're not having to kind of necessarily live paycheck to paycheck. And so I think that piece is important to mention.
Hard to be curious when you're stuck in a survival bind.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're in fight, flight, and you're if everything else in life is kind of uncertain, then you're not going to invite in more uncertainty. You're going to cling to these, like, life rafts of certainty, even if there's little, like, chips in that don't quite make sense to you. I think for most people, I say most people, a lot of people that I've met, it takes some form of crisis usually, whether it's a health crisis, whether it's losing a loved one, whether it's burnout. These things tend to crack people open to the point where they are willing to look at and examine some, very core beliefs. Religion is I think a good example.
Yeah, faith crisis.
Faith crisis, exactly. I mean, it's funny because I think I know people who are incredibly curious in certain areas, but they won't touch or look at other areas, which and I think it depends on how strongly one clings to their identity in certain areas. And we have these, many kind of internal characters. And so I don't think it's like, and I'm sure you know people who might be very curious about video games or whatever it is, but less so in other questions.
Yeah, and it doesn't, like, you can think of very, almost objectively curious people, like where they're rigorously kind of like following a scientific process of thinking. So people in academia, but then they get entrenched in their particular flavor of a theory or an academic, kind of their perspective on and paradigms are slow to shift, and they say things like, I don't know the exact quote, but it's basically like paradigms shift at the rate of funerals, pretty much. Like as the establishment dies,
right.
the guard sort of shifts, and then new ideas can emerge and take hold. So it's interesting because like this is within like sort of the halls of the self-proclaiming curious people, right? People who are like on a quest for truth, or the logos. Like, we're going to try to figure out what's the actual the secret sauce here. Like, what's the actual answer? We're not just trying to confirm our own bias, and so we blind our trials, and we do all these things to make sure that we're not just like putting our own bias on it, right? But at the end of the day, like, we're humans, and so we're like so biased, just kind of inherently, and it causes us. There's this term, I've been reading this book, Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, and it's basically, it's kind of like one of those Sapiens kind of, it's like that sort of the thesis. The task of the book is to tell the whole story, but they do it interestingly through like these different, like they'll zoom in on one culture at a particular time to talk about it, and then they'll zoom into another versus like a chronological history of events. It's a fascinating book, super heady. It's not an easy read, but one of the concepts that really stuck out to me is this idea of schismogenesis, which basically just means that cultures actually will identify themselves as what they're not. So they'll go further away from their neighbors, right? So in other words, like, I'm Republican because I'm not what those Democrats are. Do you see what I mean? And so like we actually create more and more of a divide just to be different than the other people. So our tribe has to be different from the tribe over the hill. And so we'll go way beyond our actual perspective into like radical territory of like, we don't actually think that, but we have to like go even further because we're pushing further away from this other, and it works the same way on the other side of the fence. So basically you get the schismogenesis, and you get these really niche cultures, these tribes that are very different, but they're living in the same bioregion, right? But and then over time their languages get different and stuff, right? So they just pointed to this phenomena and how it shows up over and over throughout the human story and how we evolved, and it kind of goes to show. I mean, and what it does is it provides cohesion within a group. It gives you an other, right? Which you're not, and so it creates a cohesiveness together. And so I think you see that a lot, in group out group dynamics, right? But it's this sort of the trick is it's like the sort of drive, the tribal primate drive to belong, then sabotages our sort of empirical quest for truth, right? Of like trying to be unbiased and be open to receive whatever the logos or the signal is that's trying to emerge. And instead we put these blinders up where we can't actually see it because we've got our own dissonance or bias that's kind of completely filtering all that shit out, And so I guess what have you found to be useful tools in your journey of trying to kind of shake off the cobwebs of the kind of cultural conditioning and the biases you may or may not have accumulated along the way?
Yeah, a really interesting question. That frame, what comes to mind for me is that we've actually swung away from the dogma of a lot of kind of traditional religion and gone into kind of scientism and humanism to some degree. And it feels like certainly some of the thinkers that I respect, like Mark Gaffney, Zach Stein, like they're writing about this idea of homo amor, and how this it's like a new conception of the human, which brings that pendulum kind of back into a center where it's not against something else, which I feel like scientism is in some ways rejecting a lot of the dogma of centuries, and so let's see. So I'm distracted by the puppies.
Yeah, I know. There's these dogs are just going to town on these bones. But just like, what are the? I love that you brought up Gaffney, and I'd love to double click on that later. But just the idea of like, what tools have you found that have helped you maybe see your own bias? Like John Vervaeke would say, like, take off the spectacles that you look through, and that's your worldview.
Yeah.
Right, and to be able to see, these are, instead of looking through the spectacles, now you're looking at the spectacles.
Sure.
So through, say, Vipassana or some sort of, you mentioned interior sciences, right? Through some sort of interior scientific method of being able to see your mental models, to see, the self in some sort of different meta way, where you get like meta on yourself and be able to, maybe see where you've got like blind spots or something like. I mean, by definition, you can't see your blind spots, but you know what I mean. Like, get some new insight.
No, totally. I mean, there's many ways to think about the question. I think one thing that comes to mind for me is that I don't believe that there is this like objective view from nowhere, as Nietzsche said, and I think that quest to understand something in complete objectivity is actually a huge blind spot of science, and that the way in which we perceive anything will in fact change it. So I think it's more about being aware of the lenses which we're viewing our experiences through. I think there's many different ways of examining the lenses. Like in my work with the nervous system, the state that we're in, for example, is one lens through which we are perceiving our reality. Meditations are a very kind of time-tested, often very kind of structured way of questioning the reality that we take for granted, particularly the reality of the self. So asking the question, who am I? Who am I? Kind of over and over again, and really sitting with that, and like I am not my feelings, I am not my thoughts, I am not this body, I'm not this voice, and it really does start to strip away things, and increase the surface area of uncertainty in some ways, because you can identify all these things that you're not, but it's like, well then, what am I? What is this? What is this experience? I think that can be a very rich path if it's kind of followed all the way down. And the other thing that I wanted to touch on was this distinction between epistemic versus diversive curiosity. And epistemic curiosity is like the kind of classic scientist, like finding a question and going deep, like digging a hole all the way down to the water at the bottom of the well. And diversive curiosity is much more about connecting existing dots in interesting ways. And I think that's the type that I've resonated with. Maria Popova calls it combinatorial creativity, where it's like getting deep enough to have a kind of like understanding of a certain academic kind of area, and then finding the connections between the two. So like in university, I studied philosophy and economics, and I realized there was basically no conversation between the two. And it's in those intersections that I think is the interesting territory for me. And it almost like formulates new questions. And I think that is really the art here, is like asking ourselves increasingly more interesting questions.
Love that. You gave me, now I now self-identify as what did you say, diversely curious?
Diversive curiosity.
I'm a diversively curious human, not just a regular curious human. Because I feel the same way, for sure. Like, for me, I've struggled to follow it all the way down at the bottom of the well, you know what I mean? Like, I get so inspired and fired up about something, and I'll kind of try to 80-20 it real quick. You know what I mean? And then kind of like move on to the next thing.
I'm the same.
Right? Not move on completely, but I just get captured by something else. Yeah. So, but I find we need, I would say right now we've already gone through an age of specialization. You know, and if you look at just sort of the nature of, I think, and this is so funny, you bring up economics and philosophy, and that you study both of those things because they 100% go together.
Right. Yeah.
And it's crazy to me how you can think, oh, we'll just, you know, have this kind of economic domain or system that really is the heartbeat. It is the engine, whatever you want it. I would say engine because it feels more like a machine, but it's the engine of driving the machine, right? Like the economy is what if you were to try to measure, you know, the Anthropocene, you could do it through economic metrics pretty easily, right? And just show like how much economy has contributed to, well, our explosion in population, our kind of proliferation across the planet, the exploitation of other humans and the devastation of ecosystems and the exploitation of animals for our food and all the things that we're doing. They're all behind all of that is an economic machine, right? And it's an engine driving all that forward. So to say that like philosophy, you know, really you start with philosophy and then maybe you end up at economics, maybe if it still makes sense. But like you have to start at philosophy because it's like we're not really, like Forrest Landry would say, we need to be masters of choice, right? And in order to like, you know, dodge the pickle that I alluded to earlier, like dodge the meta crisis or address it, you have to figure out how to do choice well, both on an individual and a collective basis, which to me is really a question of wisdom, which is sort of, as I understand philosophy, sort of the point of philosophy, right? So to say that like you can go into any of these different domains without philosophy seems to be missing the mark a little bit, because what you do should be informed by some sort of foundation or some sort of value set, some sort of wisdom. And so like the technical training of how you do stuff is important, like engineering, but what do you build? That's a philosophical question, right? And like we're certainly not building beautiful shit, or at least not to the, we are, some of it's actually really beautiful, but I'm saying like generally that economic machine that's completely driven by money on money return and maximizing self-interest, et cetera, homo economicus, that is, you know, not motivated by, say, the good, true, and beautiful. It's motivated by what I just said, you know, like, so it's like, those things we gotta find a way to put those together. And so to bring it back to like diversely curious, I think diversive, thank you. Diversive curiosity, to be able to find where we're missing, like where economics needs philosophy, for example, like, and drawing the dots together, right? To me is hugely important. And this is why I think guys like Daniel Schmachtenberger are like really important people, really important figures, because he's like spread over a very wide range of fields of study or domains or whatever you want to say.
Completely.
And drawing really important conclusions between them, right? And so it's, to me, but you know, he's probably got the discipline to just go deep on each one, and I just like kind of skim the surface. It's like I just listen to him say it. But yeah, like how, like since we're talking about that, have you found that to be almost both a strength and a weakness? Like diversive curiosity, like you want to go all these places, which is great, but then maybe the weakness is you're shortchanging yourself from going deep. Or deeper, right? I'm speaking for myself here, because I feel like, for example, I should be good at guitar by now. I've owned a guitar for like way too long to not be good at guitar, right? But I never had the discipline to just go super deep with it, or even the 20 really to get to just playing a bunch of songs, right? Like I never even went past the first initial real friction. So, but anyways, I was curious. It just didn't convert into real fruits in that domain. And so I'm wondering if you feel like that's robbed you in some ways, and if so, like, do you have any tools or practices that you might use to sort of like deepen when you feel called to?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do I answer that? I think I have found a couple of things that feel like they are there's like sufficient unexplored territory. I think of like the old kind of 15th century maps where they have terra incognita on them.
Yep.
And it's like, for me, those things were, when I was 19, actually discovering surfing. Like that was the first like sport activity that I just like completely fell in love with and just became obsessed with. And most of the next decade was fairly kind of dictated by my access to good surfing waves. And then I think more recently, breathwork and working with the nervous system as well is something that I've really kind of found the innate drive to go deep in as well, because it felt like there was, I mean, to me it almost doesn't feel, it just feels like with every step I take, the horizon expands and it becomes even more expansive, and there's even more to kind of touch on. So it doesn't feel like I've narrowed. It feels like by walking forward, the territory has actually expanded. And I think that's what's kept me engaged with it. And then I think by going deep enough in those areas, it almost gives me a lens through which to be curious about everything else. And I think that's interesting. Like say with Schmachtenberger, like a lot of the things that if we're talking about the meta crisis, or he describes it as global intimacy disorder, which I think is a very powerful phrase, and that is something
Gaffney talks about that as well.
Gaffney does too. Yeah, I think it's now like a shared
meme.
Yeah, they all like poaching off each other. But yeah, and kind of viewing the question of global intimacy disorder through...
I'm going to pull this way just a little bit.
Yeah, that's helpful. Through the lens of the nervous system, is like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I guess it's like going deep enough to then kind of come back, and maybe it's like climbing a mountain and the kind of exploit trade-off, and you climb up one, and then you come back down, and then you have maybe more tools, more lenses to explore other areas too.
Yeah.
My sense is that's probably what Schmachtenberger's done. Is he's got such an incredible grasp of enough of the core areas that he's then able to go really deep into new ones with these tools.
Cool. I like that. That answer surprised me in the best way, and you're totally right. Like as the lake of knowledge grows, so does the shoreline of ignorance, right? So as you're learning, you're just exploring more and more. It's almost like another metaphor might be if you're in the dark forest, exploring, and as you learn, your light is growing or something, and so you're really just seeing more as your light grows, right? You can see further into the darkness or whatever. I think that I'll use an example of how this has sort of played out for me. It just depends. I'm trying to think of how far back do you go, because it's just a daisy chain of these things where you're like what you're talking about, like where you dive in, you learn something, and then you find something that you're like, oh shit, I got to go this way, and then you go that way for a while, and you learn a bunch, then you're like, and now it's taking me over here. You know what I mean?
Totally.
And so I could go, this is the story of my life. I mean, that's I think kind of like the wake of the ship. If you're a curious person, is sort of like, it's going to take you in unexpected paths, right? Maybe that's not like always the case. Maybe, there's people who are just deeply curious about like one narrow thing, and they tunnel down, and potentially it seems like that's got to be kind of the case on some level, because you've got these people who are just ridiculously smart at physics or something, right? And they've gone all the way, and you're like, wow, and this was what I was saying before, is like we're coming fresh out of a few, I don't know, decades or centuries or something, where we've just been getting really good at certain shit. You know what I mean? Like there's people that are just, sending satellites up into space, and, just doing kind of wonky stuff for monkeys to be doing, right? Like we're planning on a trip to Mars and shit, right?
Yeah.
And we're doing stuff with AI, and it's getting weird. Yeah. So like that's happening because of this like insane ability to specialize.
Sure.
But where's the wisdom behind all of the innovation? And this is the prophecy of the eagle and the condor from South America. It's like, the condor peoples take the road of the mind, or of science and technology and sort of civilization, or whatever you want to call it. Maybe not civilization, maybe more like maybe kind of like economic revolution or industrialization or something like that. And then the condor peoples take the path of the medicines and of nature and of the heart, right? And then the prophecy is that eagle's going to basically almost wipe out the condors, right?
Sure.
And that's what happened. Like both on the level of the genocide of, post-Columbian America, and then also the condors themselves. Like condors became a very endangered species, which is kind of crazy. Yeah. And now, according to like the next step of the prophecy is like it goes that the eagle and the condor will fly in the same sky together again and give birth to higher consciousness. And so it's like, to me, having curiosity to take the condor path is something that I haven't seen out of a lot of eagles. You see what I mean? A lot of people who were very entrenched in the Western way of being curious. You know what I mean? And they kind of skip over the interior sciences or the medicine practices or the native wisdom in a lot of that's there to be seen. Yeah. And maybe it's unfair to say that about just Westerners, but for whatever reason, we're still the collective, the machine is still oriented by the old eagle ways, right? The exploitative, extractive, externalize the costs onto the commons and maximize profit type of dynamic, the Moloch dynamic, the race to the bottom, the arms race. So like that's still playing out, even though we do have more and more just, I would say, enlightened sages who are in positions of academia, you know what I mean? Like people who actually hold deep wisdom and can articulate things scientifically, right? Like, so you can bring the two types of consciousness together, but if you're completely stuck in, or just really deeply burrowed in on the level of just, Forrest Landry would say, mastery of causation or causal process. That's basically what the eagle peoples are, is they've mastered causal process. We can shoot shit into space now. Wow, we can, teleport over to the other side of the world on Zoom with our body and our voice, like we can do it with 1,000 people at once, right? Like we can do whatever we fucking want. Like there's this crazy mastery over causal process, but without the mastery of choice to go with it, right? I don't know why I feel like I needed to go all those places.
No, that's great. Like I almost want to jump in here because there's so much there. What came to mind for me was the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who I'd love to speak to on the podcast as well, and his distinction between the right and left hemispheres, and how it sounds like they're very aligned with how you just described it.
The master and the emissary, right?
Exactly, yeah, and how the left hemisphere ought to be a kind of very powerful, efficient kind of servant to the right hemisphere, but the right hemisphere is the wisdom. It is the seeing kind of the true nature of reality. It's like the heart open kind of. Right.
And real quick, he also, I think, I haven't read his book, but just from what I've gathered, he does also sort of downplay the kind of meme that left and right are completely separate or whatever.
Yeah.
And they can be categorized as left and right.
Yeah.
It's a little different than that, right?
It's more about different ways of perceiving as opposed to, I think the meme from the 60s was like, right is emotions and left is logic. But it's not like that. It's more about ways of perceiving reality. And so the left hemisphere is like, it almost like casts a net. It's very analytical. It kind of dissects everything. It's very effective at like, building rockets, that kind of thing. Whereas the right hemisphere is much more...
or hunting, right?
Or potentially, although hunting I feel like would also have a sense, there's almost like a...
intuition, like primal nature. Okay, that's a good point.
Like primal piece as well.
I was thinking of like an archer and just being very dialed in with like a precise sort of...
I mean, that might be a good example of the two working in tandem.
Okay, gotcha.
I can imagine.
But anyways, so Ian McGilchrist and this idea of the master and the emissary mapping to the sort of eagle and the condor.
So, I mean, I've thought about this, and this might sound a little bit out there, but hey, puppy. I love the work of Brian Swim, and he talks about the kind of the unfolding adventure of the universe. And for me, I wonder if there has almost been this necessary kind of like over-indexing, overweighting of the eagle in order to be able to have the capacity to create the technologies that we have. The fact that we're, you know, recording into these microphones, there are satellites overhead, the fact that AGI is potentially kind of around the corner. It almost seems like this necessary diversion, this adventure into separation, or like eagle consciousness, so that when the two are then reunited, there is this enormous like upgrade of capacity which both can have, which maybe wouldn't have been possible if there was that. I mean, that's just an idea of mine.
That's a beautiful idea. I thought of that as well.
Okay.
No, and I think that's it. Like, why else do it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, why leave the garden, so to speak?
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to get the right angle with this mic. I'm just going to tip this a little bit. Like, now we're talking. Now I can just be like lean all the way back.
That's like the philosopher's camping chair.
Yeah, seriously. This camping chair is dope. So, yeah, like, imagine, I mean, and this is what Charles is sort of pointing to, and Mark Gaffney's pointing to, and like Mark Gaffney hits it best, I think, when he says the unique symphony, the unique self symphony, and I like to add of sovereign souls at the end, because it's like there's an implicit sovereignty to sort of the unique self model that he articulates, you know, and the reason that there's the phase of separate self along the way of consciousness emerging is that we need to value the individual. We need to value individual autonomy and sovereignty and basic human rights and things of that nature, right? That's super important. So it's not to say that like, oh, we're all just one cosmic, you know, goo called God or whatever, you know, where we're just like, we're all part of the field, which is in fact quite true. I mean, there is no outside edge to the universe. And so like, that's what I'm pointing to when I use the word God. It's just sort of like the whole field itself, the field of being. But to hold that and also hold the paradox, like that you're not separate from anything else, and you're uniquely an expression, a one-off expression of cosmos where you're unlike everything else, like you're uniquely you. So this is kind of paradox where you're this fundamentally the same and one with all, great spirit, and then you've got like this unique. The universe is it's infinitely featured, and you're one of the unique features of cosmos, right? So to hold those two things simultaneously, to me, and then to also, so that's kind of like unique self, right? Those two things together, it's like, wow, I'm this, you know, whole beautiful creation, and also I'm, you know, Christianing, or you know what I mean? Like I'm doing some expression of cosmos through this unique expression of it. So that's rad. And then to figure out, oh shit, and we could have a fucking symphony of everybody adding their own unique music into some sort of harmony, where we figure out how to do effective collective choice making, right? Where we have some sort of collective North Star, like say, you know, planet Earth, like green planet.
The field of values, I think, is what Mark Gaffney talks about it.
Yeah. So like, what is it that we value as a collective, right? A good example of, you know, an obvious one is just like, oh, well, if we knew that, say, you know, the guys who are all behind, are you familiar with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis?
I've heard of it, but feel free to.
Okay, it's a little bit of a tangent. I'm gonna say something, and then I'll set it, and then I'll come back. But basically, the idea that, you know, we could find out, okay, a 10-kilometer sized object is going to collide with the Earth, and it's going to be the end of civilization, right? And it'll be potentially the end of our species, depending on the severity of the impacts or whatever. We don't know how bad it's going to be, right? Like it could go all the way from like, oh, it's just resetting the history, or it could be, you know, dinosaur level and mammals.
Was this what happened like 12,000 years ago?
Yeah. So that's Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, is just simply in a nutshell that something melted enough ice to raise sea levels like 400 feet in like a 100-year period, right? And up to 50 feet in like a single year or something. So basically, you're getting like a tremendous amount of flooding, and the scablands of the northwestern U.S. show this, right? And
Indonesia as well, I think a lot of it got
right. So
flooded.
It's all over the world, because I mean the sea levels have risen all over the world, right? So there's this crazy planetary event that causes a huge climate event that ends the Ice Age. It's the end of the Pleistocene. It's the beginning of this period called the Younger Dryas, which is a 1600-year period of just absolute devastation. Worst time to be a human. And all of our ancestors survived that, which is crazy. So we have a genetic signature. We have ancestral memory of that event. And, well, I shouldn't say event, it's 1,600 years of life. So many ancestors who just lived through this period. And there's all these crazy cave cities in the Middle East where they just dug into the ground like ants.
In like
they
Eastern Turkey, it's fascinating. There's like a cross-section image that I've seen. It's like an entire city underground. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, up to like 10,000 people in there or something, some crazy amount of people.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm exaggerating the number, but there's many of these, and they're still finding them. So it was basically just like, okay, it's raining death. We need to get underground, right? Or and seriously, and there's like all these memes and myths around dragons and serpents, fire serpents in the sky. And, you know, the gods being angry. Like, what would it look like if the gods were angry, right? Like lightning and fucking meteors and shit and giant floods, right? Yeah. So apocalyptic time, and something. There had to be some sort of energy source that melted and freed up the North American ice cap. So what was that energy source, right? That's the question. Was it just a couple degrees of warming and then it just melted? It's like, no, that wouldn't do it over that dramatic of a period, right? And it wouldn't make everything go extinct, because the sea levels would be rising gradually, and you could just, you could recede from the coast or whatever, I would imagine. But this was like this was apocalyptic flooding.
Yeah, overnight type event.
Right, and like the scablands show traces of flooding that were like, I don't know the numbers, but like Randall Carlson obviously is the guy like talking about, he likes to dive deep on that. But basically, like, you've got this crazy event, in the boundary and in the geology where they dig down to that layer, the Younger Dryas boundary. It's this black matte layer, and it's black because all of the algae that grew during that time. So it's just like not a lot of shit growing besides algae, and it's like showing up in the sediment. And then there's these impact proxies, which are like high impact melt glass and these nanospherules that only form under insane pressure and temperature, and these rare metals that come from objects from space like platinum, iridium, and these like strange things. So basically, that's the hypothesis. There's a bunch of people, across many domains who are behind this hypothesis in academia that this is what happened, and that this is what all the flood myths come from, right? And the deluge myths, right? So if we were to say wake up to that reality, right? Or maybe it's not the whole reality. Maybe it wasn't an impact. Maybe they're wrong, but something happened, right? So, all the megafauna went extinct. The Clovis people went extinct. We woke up as a species with amnesia, as like Graham Hancock likes to say, right? So there's something, and it's like, I don't care what your story is about history. No one has explained to me sufficiently why those pyramids are there, like how they were constructed. Like the theories are laughable, of like bronze age civilization cutting through blocks of limestone with a bronze saw. It's like, give me a fucking break. Where are the saw marks? They're nowhere. And it's like, you look at the Sphinx and there's these crazy, like somebody took some sort of ice cream scooper and scooped the rock out like underneath. Like it's bizarre, like the shit that they're finding in Egypt. These pots that are so perfectly engineered. They've put them in these like crazy aerospace like technology where they like scan the object for any tiny deviance of off of the center or whatever, and it's like a perfectly engineered vase that couldn't have been done by hand, like with a potter's wheel or something, and it's made from granite, and it's like, what the fuck? It's like, what's going on, right? So there's all these mysteries about the past, which if we had curiosity and a little bit of humility, we would just be like, holy shit, what happened? Let's go figure it out. But instead, we're wearing these old hats of like, no, this is the story, and we're keeping together the status quo because we've got like maybe some sort of existential fear would probably be one aspect of it, and just the fear of like really not knowing, and then also, you know, your academic career can sometimes be hinging on things that you've written books about and stuff like that, right? So for whatever reason, paradigms shift very slowly, and I don't think we've really shifted. I mean, you got guys like Rogan talking about it on a huge platform, so you know there's that. But I don't know if on the mainstream academic level we've updated our worldviews about, say, like origins of human civilization, and maybe the fact that it could have been at least another cycle of human civilization or many cycles of human civilization, and that we see through the glass darkly into the past. We just don't really know, you know, and to act like we've got this like certainty of like the evolution of man, and we tell it in the history books as so matter-of-factly. And I think it's a little bit of a bummer, because I think the rocks are still up there. You know what I mean? I don't think that they just go away. Like there's still plenty of rocks, and so the theory is that the Taurid meteor stream is sort of the problem zone, the problem area. Most of the big objects in space get pulled in by Jupiter. So Jupiter is sort of the guardian angel. And the year I was born, 1992, there was this massive, I think it was a comet that hit Jupiter called Shoemaker-Levy 9, and you could see it through telescopes. Like it was this crazy impact to Jupiter. So it's like kind of protecting us, but then every once in a while these objects get past, and then they enter the inner solar system. And so that happened some number of thousands of years ago, and it created this Taurid meteor stream when a comet disintegrated in the inner solar system. And now we go through this belt of rock twice a year, right? So end of June, and then right at the end of October, beginning of November, so Halloween, the 31st. So every single culture has the Day of the Dead or the Day of Souls, or maybe not every culture, but it's ubiquitous around the world, right? Yeah. And so there's always this sort of remembering of like death, you know, right around like the 31st and the 1st. And I think that's kind of a fascinating coincidence that's when we go through the Taurid meteor stream every year, right? And maybe 12,000 years ago, we went through a section of it that's particularly gnarly, right, and rough, and potentially that just was remembered through our stories in over deep time when we lost all the other knowledge and everything else. We remembered we remembered the calamity that was the end of time, right, and the beginning of something new. So you have these like pre-diluvian and antediluvian, or those are the same thing, pre-diluvian, post-diluvian, civilization, right? Where, anyway, so here we are, and it's just like, to circle back, and I'll stop ranting. I kind of went on this Younger Dryas tangent, but like, if we were to be able to level up, bring the eagle, the condor together, right? Be able to make collective effective choices, what would be our North Star? What would be our collective value that we discover together, right? And I would just say, like, an obvious one that comes up for me is like, well, if there's another rock, we're all in this shit together, right? And to me, actually, it's not an if there's another rock. Scientifically speaking, I think probabilistically speaking, it's saying when there's another rock, and you just have to fast forward some amount of time to find it. So it's coming. There's, some complex, crazy equation that proves the impact trajectory of some object that already exists in space. We just haven't found it and mapped the math out, right? That would be an engineering problem, which we could do now with AI. We could probably solve the complexity of space with AI, potentially, maybe not, but like, it's a huge problem. But like, if you open source that problem and funded it, what would happen to planetary defense, say, if we were to try to map all of the planetary threats that were in our, say, near Earth orbit, or whatever you want to call it, right? And namely the Taurid meteor stream in this case. So like, basically, collectively choosing what do we do together. I don't know how we make the shift to this. I don't know if it takes an impact before, and maybe there's like, because COVID didn't do it. COVID didn't snap us into global consciousness. Well, it did give us a global awareness, but it didn't snap us into like collective intelligence on the level of coordinated, coherent kind of capacity as a collective, right? And so that's something I'm really fascinated by, is like, how do we do effective collective choice making? And I think our generation, how old are you?
34.
Yeah, so we're like a couple years apart. I'm 31. We're gonna be growing up in the time where like we're trying to solve that problem. Like, that's the main problem. It's a coordination failure. Like, we've got all the other shit dialed. We can do whatever the fuck we want. We got all the creative capital and the resources and whatever we need. Earth is abundant, and creativity is boundless, and there's 8 billion of us. We have a coordination failure.
Yeah. What comes to mind for me is less about like, how do we kind of state, here are the values, and then work towards those. It's more like, how do we create the conditions? And this maybe comes back to curiosity. How do we create the conditions for each individual node of consciousness, each human, to be part of that unique self-symphony? And I believe, at least, that when everyone is kind of in that field and has both an awareness of, let's say, the true nature of reality, and that everything is in the field of interbeing, and they're also aware of their own unique contribution, I think that this coordination problem will solve itself in a way. That's my sense. And so it's more a question for me of like, how do we create the conditions for that to exist? And I like the idea of, you know, if a meteor was you know, let's say like 6 months away from, I mean, there's literally a film about this. Don't look up. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I recently read a book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe by Christopher Bash. Have you come across it?
No, I haven't.
I'm actually going to be hopefully talking with him in a couple of weeks. But he spent, I think, over 20 years doing, I believe it was 73 high-dose LSD journeys. And over that period of time, there were many things that, and this book is kind of like a detailed series of these trip reports about what he learned, kind of investigating the nature of the cosmos, like through the like microscope of these high-dose LSD journeys. And one of the visions that he came back with, Lola's starting to dig recently. Lola. And one of the visions that he came back with was what he called the birth of the future human, which actually tracks with, now that I'm saying it out loud, Daniel Schmachtenberger has this image of like these increasingly intense crises that humanity's going through, almost being like birth contractions, such that we are giving birth to some new form of consciousness. In Christopher's visions, he saw intense suffering, which I think he believed it to be climate related, or climate kind of caused suffering, that created this like intensity and melting pot, which brought humanity together in this way, and then gave birth to this basically new form of consciousness.
So the obstacle is the way, and as the pressure cooker of the external environment gets hotter and crazier, we are forced to
and I think
shift.
We see this on a personal level too. Like for me, the time where I felt like I grew the most as a human was in the most intense period of my life, through grief and through loss. And I think, although, you know, we don't ever wish for shit things to happen, it is usually in that in that intensity where we grow and evolve the most. And I imagine that would be true of humanity as well as on a personal level.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's the one of those sort of uncomfortable truths, because you're like, fuck, it's gonna have to get worse. Because I mean, I would say right now it's bad enough to like, since COVID in particular, I think there's been a lot of people. I mean, you and I are sort of testaments to this, I guess, for whatever reason. You know, I wonder if we're more of like the exception that proves the rule, or if there's many people who are whose life trajectory has shifted, and to maybe use a metaphor, like they're no longer running a script, and they're more like a live player in the game, right? And I wonder how many percentage wise, if we're seeing an increase and a shift towards live playership and sort of like, I would call that sovereignty.
And fewer NPCs.
And fewer NPCs, right. Or if like it has to get significantly worse before that crisis is the catalyst for the tower moment, right? Like the tower moment in the tarot. Are you familiar with tarot at all?
Oh yeah, sure.
So the tower is the 16th card in the major arcana of the tarot.
Right.
It's basically like the moment of destruction and enlightenment.
Right.
So as you see the old thing crumble, it's like, oh, of course, and you're
which is what apocalypse means, like unveiling, essentially.
So that's basically what it is. Yeah, it's the tower.
Yeah.
You're the whatever you would say, or what the veil. No, there's a fucking metaphor here. Something is removed from your eyes, right? And you see it, right?
Blinders.
Yeah, whatever. So, but yeah, I don't know. I want to. I mean, I wonder what the people. It's tough because people have been seeing this coming for a long time. In fact, like this eagle condor prophecy is pretty old, a couple of thousand years old from the Amazon. So it's really interesting. But it feels like I don't know. I have a hard time just like, finding like the kind of two big scripts that come up in society are like just, optimizing for like, a good stable job, like something that's you're gonna retire on and it's gonna whatever. And so you're just sort of like, in a way, chasing the dollar. And then the other one is sort of just like chasing pleasure. It's like I'm chasing powder, I'm chasing waves, or I'm hitting the next peak, or, I'm going to the next rave or whatever. And I'm just sort of like hitting peak experiences. And that's the purpose of life, right? So it's like security. And so like kind of that's sort of conformity. And then there's like hedonism or just sort of like peak states, right? And yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's, for me, those things, I've been through both of those phases. And so I don't blame or judge anybody in any of those phases at all, like, or who are in, just living their life. Like, I have a lot of empathy for just the way that our culture is sort of, just the backdrop that everyone's part of. And so it's sort of informing how we live in lots of ways. And so I don't, it's actually very difficult to kind of like, even just go against the grain to be a healthy, awake individual, right? Like that's actually takes a lot of effort initially. There's a lot of inertia and like force pushing you the other way, going with the stream. So I don't blame the current or the stream of people, but it seems like we need to be able to find a new mode beyond just hedonism and conformism or whatever, right? And so for me, it's like seeing this existential reality that's already here. It's imminent, right? And we're in sort of the liminal space between the old story and what was possible, and then sort of like either the more beautiful world or the apocalypse or both. Right? Like we're in sort of this liminal space, and you look around and it's fucking beautiful here in Colorado, and then there's like birds chirping and it's like sunny, the dogs are chewing on bones. Like I'm having a great chat with a bro. Like nothing's wrong with this moment. This moment's awesome. And then at the same time, there's this like understanding that like also there's this sort of imminent crisis.
Sure.
Which is so it's really hard for most people to, I think, hold that because they're just like, going through the motions of their day. Yeah. Yeah. I have this way of just like talking and not ending it with anything to pass it back over to you. I'm just like, for me, I'm just like riffing on whatever comes up.
I feel like there are multiple tennis balls being like tossed across the court. Well, one thing that came to mind for me was kind of speaking to the drive of like security, like making it, kind of like, being a self-made man, starting a business, those things, and the drive to hedonism. I think, as you say, they're both very important impulses, and they're both also stages. And there's many different models of human development. I think all of them have something to offer. One that I really love is from this pretty obscure guy called Bill Plotkin, who founded Animas Valley, and he ran vision quests for like 40 years. And he has this wheel of development where he basically, he says that humans need to construct a really solid, stable ego in kind of the first part of life. And that will often include, maybe having spiritual experiences, getting their, basic needs met, maybe starting a family, like those things, and then go through a phase that he calls the journey of soul descent, which is basically a great unraveling of the ego structures. And at the bottom of that, he says that there is a kind of a mythopoetic identity, or like an image at the center of your life, which is the template for what you are here to do in the world. And he uses the life of Carl Jung actually as like a beautiful example of how Carl Jung went through these two separate soul descents, and how a lot of his writing was informed by what he discovered at the bottom of these. And so I think to kind of map that onto what you were saying is many of us, and Bill actually says he believes that 85 to 90% of the adult population are still in this early stage adolescence in his model. And because we lack the initiations, we lack the rites of passage, and we lack the eldership to bring people safely into the liminal space and into the soul descent, we're kind of getting stuck and stunted here. And what we need are more of these, both these like understandings and these kind of like initiatory practices that can safely guide people through basically like ego death, essentially.
Yeah, that sounds like the Eleusinian mysteries to me.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of it's a death practice, or practicing resurrection. Yeah, that's, and we actually met for the first time at the MAPS conference. Right, the MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I think that's the first time I've said that right the first time. I was surprised that it came out.
I don't think I could remember that. I'm glad you said it.
MAPS, we'll just remember that. And they did the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver, which was the craziest place to be, because it was like...
It was like Eagle and Condor in the very same,
dude, and it was
same building.
And it was like, holy fuck, this is mainstream. This is crazy.
12,000 people.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, because I growing up in like a small fundamentalist town, like, psychedelics are very much not part of the curriculum. They're not part of the rite of passage at all, right? And most places in the U.S. that's the case, right? I mean, I don't know of any towns in our society who have like a healthy container for psychedelics. I mean, there's probably some
possibly
now.
Boulder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, or somewhere like where the hippie movement's been alive and well for like many decades, right? But it was interesting to see. Like this above board kind of open conversation by a whole culture represented by all kinds of different people from different backgrounds, right? I mean, that was one of the things that stood out to me about it, was just how diversely it was like the different faces and voices of the psychedelic movement, right? From the sort of capitalist public company, sort of like market perspective to the indigenous sacred medicine path perspective, right? So there's like a huge spectrum, and it was both exciting and also a little bit terrifying, just to see how, we still have the same, multipolar race to the bottom dynamics that are going to infect psychedelics, that are going to infect, everything that we're doing, right? So, you hate to think about what's the society like, right? Like maybe it's the what is Aldous Huxley's book called, Brave New World, and just sort of like the society where we shill soma out to the masses, right? And have this sort of commodification around it, and this numbing or whatever it is. I don't know, but I do think that having the conversation and having it above board and moving towards legalization, or at least decriminalization, is a huge step forward. And it feels like, we have sort of like the Promethean fire. You know what I mean? Like, if that's not what psychedelics are, I don't know what the Promethean fire is, right? Like, it's like, if you want to have that initiatory experience that you pointed to, to die before you die, right? That is what was being practiced at Eleusis, and that is what the Greek civilization was built upon, really. and the mystery traditions of both Eastern and Western man, have had, I mean, definitely in the West, psychedelic practices, right, and psychedelic sacraments, and it definitely seemed to impact early Christianity as well. And it was Jesus was another iteration of a wine god called Dionysus, right? And there's a lot of really interesting evidence that guys like Brian Murarescu have written about in his book Immortality Key. But to get to like where we're at now, and to try to resurrect that wisdom and bring a new modern kind of cultural container. And I think those are going to exist in many forms in many cultures. And it'll be everything from like, ayahuasca churches to like, Jamie Will would say lizard brain fuck monkeys, like hitting all the pleasure buttons.
He doesn't
like,
usually sugarcoat it.
Yeah, just taking your, taking the drugs, right? Whatever, as many as possible. So yeah, like, what do you think about how psychedelics play into this, both from the perspective of like Plotkin and helping us cross from this sort of adolescent frame and and to bring in what Stein and Gaffney are doing with like tragic and post-tragic, right?
I love that
like,
frame.
To me, that's what psychedelics are as well, is it's a shift from the pre-tragic in some ways.
And also potentially from the tragic to the post-tragic.
Exactly, yeah.
It can be. Yeah, that's a really great question. Where to even begin? One thing that comes to mind is something Jamie Will said at MAPS, was that Rick Doblin kind of made the deal with the devil, like made the Faustian bargain with his eyes open, like knowing that there were going to be these kind of capitalistic challenges, but that was ultimately the only way to democratize these medicines, basically. And I think of psychedelics broadly as being amplifiers of consciousness, and so the real question is like, what is it that they're being used to amplify, and how can the set and settings be designed and held like really fucking tightly, so that these initiations of various forms can take place. And I think we're starting with the kind of therapeutic model, which is a great starting point in terms of reducing all of the stigma that has been fairly widespread over the last 20-30 years more. But I think from there, it's how can these technologies of the psyche, these like soul revealing, that's what psychedelic means, how can they be used for deeper exploration of one's own psyche and understanding some of the kind of fundamental truths of reality as well.
Nature of self, nature of reality.
Yeah.
Stripping away all of the lenses.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, they're going to be used by so many different people and groups in so many different ways. And Jamie's book Recapture the Rapture is actually a very well written playbook in a way of how do you build non-culty cults, or how do you build ethical cults, because that I think is what is going to happen. And it's easy for people to take psychedelics, have these profound experiences, and then come back and interpret them through their limited cultural lenses and in contexts which aren't necessarily conducive to human flourishing, let's say. So yeah, it's such an interesting time. I mean, even recently, ayahuasca is now legal in Colorado here as a sacrament, and so I think it's like I think my concern is that they will be taken out of their kind of ceremonial and really sacred contexts and kind of plugged into this sterile therapeutic model, which may be effective at curing depression, addiction, these things, but it will still be missing the point of the ceremony in some ways. I think that's definitely a concern that I have.
Yeah, I was having this conversation with Alexander Beiner at the conference.
Oh, wow.
And to me, that's sort of it, right? Like I've got kind of three ways to sort of boxes to put psychedelics into, right? Well, I guess there's four. There's the there's the one that's sort of mainstream, which is that they're kind of like taboo, off limits, don't go there.
Don't take drugs.
Right? Don't do drugs. And you might break your brain if you do, right? Or something like that. And you'll certainly be, a whack job or something. So it's kind of heretical. And then you've got the therapeutic. So heretical, therapeutic, which is more like medicine, take it as a way to cure your depression, your trauma, your illness, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's the sort of maybe sacred, which is like, the ceremonial sort of indigenous container for it, which is more like still, medicine, but with a different layer, not like a sterile medical frame, but more of like you wouldn't just use it like any other drug, right?
Yeah,
it's not like in medicine, it's like I might give you this for, an antibiotic or whatever.
I think it's more like the healing as a byproduct. Like they often take them to commune with plant spirits and plant consciousness and for the sake of ceremony as opposed to as a means to an end.
And it always seems to, not always, but it's very often associated with a community and a maloka or some sort of gathering space with others, right? So it's held together in a community container, which to me feels like half the medicine, is just like connecting in a space and going through transformational experiences with others seems to be a powerful catalyst for healing in and of itself and reconnection, right? And then there's a fourth one, which I am personally a fan of. I don't think it's for everybody, which is more of like the psychonaut. It's more of like just explorer, right? And I think that that's actually an important one too, even though I do think that, so I don't think that they should be heretical. I don't think that it should just be medical, right? I do definitely think it should be considered sacred and have some sort of community container. And I also think that there should still be space in some ways for exploration.
Absolutely. And I think you'd really appreciate this book by Christopher Bash, because he also described psychedelics as a tool for a new form of philosophy that wasn't based on abstract ideas, but was based on direct experience. And taking LSD at those quantities, like it very, very much does open up planes. And some of he also came at it through a Buddhist frame as well. He was a, I think, philosophy professor and taught Buddhism there as well. But he ended up coming away with insights, some of which kind of contradicted some of the Buddhist ideas. Like it gets quite out there at times, and he also believes in reincarnation as well, which I think is another interesting frame, which there is now like a good amount of like actual scientific research around as well in the University of Virginia and other places. And I think it's something that is becoming more, at least people are more open to.
I think that I was talking about this same topic last night, and psychedelics are all the rage right now. So I think a lot of people are talking about it, but this concept of ethical cult building or ethical culture, right? How do you build? Because clearly, one of the, like you said, we have a global intimacy disorder, right? And a failure of intimacy, of connection, and that's leading to a coordination failure, right? It's like really intimacy is at the heart of the problem. So it's intimacy with self, it's intimacy with nature, it's intimacy with tribe. Like we've sort of, and Eisenstein writes about this, turned neighbors and relationships into services, right? And our environment into goods, right? Like, so the forest is now timber, right? And that's how we see it. So that's one big problem, is we've got this huge intimacy disorder, which is fracturing us off from wholeness or from interbeing. And we need desperately some sort of cultural wave of transformation, right? That's going to reconnect us, turn us back on individually, connect us to each other in dialogos, in collaboration, right? In mutual trust and care and community and tribe, right? Like what we're actually wired for and what we've evolved for over deep time was optimizing for really interdependence on each other, right? And it's something actually pleasurable and desirable about having your tribe, right? And people that you can actually, it's actually the optimal way to be a human, right? Like we evolved at the level of the colony or the tribe, right? Like how an ant colony organism is actually, it's at the colony level, not the individual ant level. And same with like bees. A bee by itself doesn't make any sense really, or an ant by itself doesn't make a whole lot of sense in an ecosystem.
Right.
But as a colony, as a hive, it totally is an organism. It's a superorganism. And it's coordinated. And it's a togetherness thing. And you'll see colonies war against other colonies, right? So we don't want that kind of toxic tribalism where we're just like picking a group, schismogenesis, and then we fight all the neighbors, right? It's more like we need to have both the reconnecting and the reimagination of intimacy, along with some sort of global value set and coordination capacity so that we can steward, say, the Pacific Ocean, right? And like our real commons of the planet, right? And the air and stuff. So, for me, psychedelics seem to be one of these tools, or maybe I shouldn't say one of these. I mean, there are a lot of really potent tools, but I don't think there's anything quite like psychedelics in the sense that I could just give you 4 tabs of acid and you're going to be you're going to have an experience.
Pretty reliable.
It's pretty reliably. Yeah. Like you might go to Tibet and on an inner science journey, right? And you might come back a sage in 20 years, but, having a heroic dose of mushrooms or a DMT experience or something of that nature, even an MDMA experience, it can be absolutely revelatory and even more so inside the proper rite of passage sort of cultural communal container, whatever that is, right? So that's a real area of curiosity for me, is how do we do that and not have it be culty cult, right? So like, how do you steward psychedelics in like a sacred container that doesn't turn into the culty cult where you're coercing, manipulating, or extorting the members, the individuals or whatever that is, and then also not skew or bend towards just like the tragedy of the commons in the market sense, right? Where it's just a race to the bottom. It's just completely commodified. It's just big pharma 2.0, Prozac 2.0, right? And so like those to me seem like the 2 edges we want to sort of like navigate between and find the balance and the polarities, and find this sort of balance between individual freedom, sovereignty, and then collective coherence and tribe, and bring, really probably our best hope at evolving, as a species would be like the way we use psychedelics. And so, I'm curious what you think about that and how we might, move forward. You and I and all the other millennials who plan on being here in 2050 and shit.
I don't know. I really don't know. I think it is one of the questions of this time in some ways. I asked, I spent 2 weeks at the Monastic Academy in Vermont.
Oh, I really want to go there.
It's a beautiful place, and I have so much admiration and respect for Soyu, who is the founder and the teacher there. And I asked him this question in one of the kind of Q&As towards the end, and he also didn't know, but I think he had a lot more suspicion than maybe most of us kind of young, enthusiastic millennials have. And his view was, well, I won't speak for him, but what I took from it was that psychedelics can be incredibly potent at the beginning of someone's journey to kind of like smash open the default scripts, basically. Like for myself, I lived as I had kind of Christianity shoved down my throat at school, and I then became an atheist, kind of Sam Harris devotee, rationalist, materialist, like all those things. And psychedelics was one of the things that helped me to like really break open that that paradigm. And I think that's one I can pause while the plane.
No, it's all right. Go ahead.
Give the puppy some love as well.
Yeah, the world's not going to stop for our podcast, but I prefer to be outside. It's nice.
There we go.
She is a handful. She's so fun. Yeah. So it's funny, the bouncing to Sam Harris, like materialism. Well, I shouldn't just like categorize him as just materialism. That's not what I mean. But like atheism, I guess.
Yeah.
New atheism.
And so with that, and I think there's also a risk of like something that's an open question for me is, does anything like what changes at the end after someone has a kind of intense psychedelic experience? Like what has actually shifted? And I think that there is the risk of the applying the lens of like chasing peak experiences, and there's people out there who've done dozens and dozens of medicine journeys, and arguably in some ways it's only strengthened their egos rather than actually had any helpful impact on their maturity. And I think for me one of the biggest pieces is like having it be held by a true elder. And I think those are so like rare, honestly, in our culture, that without that, I think there's so much risk that they just amplify what is already there. And so I think that for me is the biggest piece, is how do we find elders or people who have like eldership qualities and really like empower them. And these people are also the least likely to probably want to run a medicine ceremony.
Yeah, it depends on the culture, right?
Yeah,
like you've definitely got those medicine women, medicine men, grandmothers, like abuelas, abuelos. You know what I mean? There's elders for sure. Definitely even elders in our society. I think the point though is that we don't have a lineage, we don't have a tradition, so we don't have the sort of elders who have, say, been drinking ayahuasca their whole lives, or taking, like some sort of other medicine or whatever it is. But we, that hasn't been our cultural trajectory. So we don't really, we need some sort of like fusion, right? Where on the one hand, you don't want to completely culturally appropriate, and ruin something for peoples who've already had everything taken away from them, like by taking away peyote, or like by doing something like that, where, but at the same time, there's some wisdom there that's super fucking important that we need to figure out how to adopt into our society, right? And the sweat lodge, right? Like these, like I've been through a few, Red Road, Lakota ceremonies with the sweat lodge and with the cactus ceremonies, and the wisdom in those is just like profound. It's simple, but also profound and experiential, and you're doing it together as a group. So there's something like that we could take from all these indigenous wisdom keepers and also, fit it into the modern context, our modern world, right? So I'm not saying that we should just like, cling to some legacy, but like we definitely need to figure out how to translate the wisdom coming from these currents that these elders have kept alive. You know what I mean? Like there's elders who've kept the shit alive for sure. It's just like, how do we make that like integrated into, Western society when most of those elders still need the medicine? You know what I mean? They still haven't had the first experience, the first initiatory experience, right? So how could, like, say my grandma be the wisdom keeper of like a psychedelic altar when she's never had a psychedelic experience, right? That's kind of what I'm pointing to. So, it's weird. And then that's why I think it's going to be messy.
Yeah.
We don't have any of the training wheels,
I agree. I mean, I don't think anyone knows. I think it's going to be a period of a lot of experimenting and probably a lot of fuck ups, I imagine. And I probably some horror stories that appear in the press. Like I think in the beginning there was this like kind of delusional excitement over the potential psychedelic renaissance, and I think now we're kind of coming into almost like the trough on the other side, where I think there will be maybe some media stories of experiences that go badly, or just ways in which it's used inappropriately.
Yeah. If it's anything like crypto, it's going to be a shit show. It's going to be a fucking shit show.
We've got a bear market incoming.
Yeah, but I feel like, honestly, it's funny. I think psychedelics and blockchain are super similar. They're super similar to me because they're both these like radical disruptors and, catalysts for real transformation.
And hype.
And a ton of hype, and and the maximalist culture, psychedelics or Bitcoin will save the world or whatever, there's a bunch of problems that come with it, obviously, and just the same way that in Bitcoin there's a shit ton of scams, right? Tons of fraud and scams. Mm-hmm. In psychedelica, there's going to be tons of cults. There's going to be tons of exploitation and extortion, and just. Probably a lot of messiness. I mean, it's already happening, but I would say we haven't seen the mainstream wave yet, right?
I think so, yeah.
And that's going to be wonky, because what happens when you get, somebody who's just been blown wide open, right, in the hands of not the compassionate wisdom keeper, like trusted elder, etc., but instead the predator, the charlatan, you know what I mean? The people who are like in it for me, not in it for thee, right?
Yeah.
So it's gonna be wonky, walking into an interesting decade for sure. It's trippy time to be alive. And Biner, Alexander Biner, was, when we were talking, his whole book actually is really fascinating. It's a really cool read. You should talk to him if you haven't. He's a really cool guy to talk to. He's a co-founder of Rebel Wisdom.
Yeah.
And his book, it's called The Bigger Picture: How Psychedelics Can Help Us Make Sense of the World. And he kind of draws this analogy because he was part of the DMT trials at Imperial College London. Oh, wow. So he's taking like big hits of intravenous.
They were being intravenously. Wow,
yeah.
I didn't know he was part of that.
Yeah. So he sort of like draws this analogy between psychedelics and AI in the sense that I'm trying to remember if he does this in the book or if this was just part of his panel at MAPS. But anyways, we talked about it, which is basically the idea that like you're going to be, in the internet now encountering these entities that you really don't even know if they're human, increasingly so, and in the next year or two, maybe less, hopefully not that fast, but like we're going to see a total breakdown in the information ecology of like truth.
Yeah, well, the deep fakes already exist.
Yeah.
They're just not evenly distributed yet.
Yeah. So we're probably like the next version of GPT away from there being just like total pandemonium in the sense of like all the content can be generated at the drop of a hat, and to know what is real and what's not real, what's human, what's not human. You know what I mean? Like, how do you know that the clip you're watching is actually a person and not just a simulated fake, like a rendering, right? That can be generated as quickly as speaking, and I can just go text to video or voice to video or whatever it is, and the AI just like generates what I'm saying. Like that's coming, and it's, what we have to figure out, like proof of reality, or not proof of reality, proof of like solidarity, proof of authenticity, right? So like that's where blockchain's super important, super important. And we also, need to have razor sharp discernment, and I think that's where psychedelics can be super important. Like, I feel like psychedelics, I mean, they're not just going to make you have discernment, but like it definitely is this catalyst of for me, it's been a tool that's really shown me, it's been humility, and it's shown me that like it's kind of cracked, it's humbled my ego. And maybe that's in the container of, maybe that's because of the container I was in, I don't know, but just coming out of like say an ayahuasca retreat and being just very, you know, like confused and sort of like raw and sort of like really, really like uncertain, you know what I mean? And having that kind of uncertainty has, I think, led to more discernment, you know, if that's the right way to say it. Like it's led to like more curiosity and honing in my ability to sort of make sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that like we're trying to figure out, going into the age of AI and psychedelics and all this stuff, is just like, how are we going to sharpen our toolkit for discernment? So what are your thoughts? Like, how do you do that?
Well, the thing that comes to mind for me is that like both blockchain and AI and psychedelics, it almost feels like these are enormous forces which are being birthed, and really all we can do is attempt to kind of steward them through in the best way that we can. And I in the conversation I had with Kevin Kelly, we talked about this sort of like what technology wants and what AI wants, and I think it's interesting to ask, like, you know, what do psychedelics want? What does ayahuasca want? What does blockchain want? And do our best to anticipate the failure points kind of ahead of time. And yeah, I mean, discernment often comes from making shit decisions. It comes from like
Experience.
fuck ups, yeah. and so maybe it's like, and I guess this is how they're attempting to roll out ChatGPT, by doing it very incrementally, so that the failures aren't so expensive, so that there can be lots of little experiments, lots of little tests. And that probably feels like how psychedelics and blockchain should also be approached, where it's safe to experiment, it's safe to get it wrong, it's safe to kind of be curious, and hopefully that through those iterations there becomes a kind of shared playbook that emerges.
Yeah. So on a personal level, what's your discernment toolkit, or what tools have worked for you? What experiences have helped you sharpen your, you know, the sword of discernment for you? Sense making. Because I mean, we're in like we're approaching post-truth, you know, pretty quick, and so and even just COVID, you know, COVID was kind of a post-truth moment. Like it was a breakdown in a lot of people's, you know, pulling back the veil and realizing like, oh, I fucking don't know. Yeah. You know, and I'm seeing how off the rails these people are going.
Yeah. I think that, well, honestly, I mean, conversations like this, like having conversations with other kind of curious and like people who are unafraid to question, I think is very helpful, and being exposed to different worldviews, and doing my best to put myself in the shoes of people that I don't agree with. I think that's definitely been a practice to some degree, and knowing that like they believe what they believe for a reason, and doing my best to kind of like steel man as many sides as possible. Having, you know, had a number of friends that went down conspiratorial rabbit holes, and really trying to like dig into like what is the signal here, what is the thing that this is giving them, and what is the wisdom here. I think that this is probably my answer. Breathwork has really connected me to my emotions, and I feel like through hundreds of journeys at this point, as well as some other practices, this emotional fluidity has built. And I love this idea from Joe Hudson, who's a kind of a mentor of mine, where he says that when we think we have a decision to be made, it's usually a sign that there is an unfelt emotion there to be expressed. And I think that often we make shit decisions, we make shit choices because we're afraid to feel a certain emotion. And I think that actually one of the most fundamental sense-making skill sets to cultivate is emotional fluidity. Because when we are truly not afraid to feel, whether it's disappointment, shame, rejection, grief, like when we're not afraid to have those sensory experiences, we're not biased by any particular choice point, and often the next right step becomes obvious. So I actually think that the skill to be cultivated is the willingness to welcome the full spectrum of emotion, and from feeling through something, the next choice, the next thing to say is usually obvious.
Sorry, I can't figure this fucking mic out today. And the shade and stuff. Yeah, so I totally agree. I think that emotional intelligence, right?
And it's more than intelligence. It's like a somatic intelligence.
Right.
Well.
It's embodied.
Yeah.
And that's why I love that you brought up breathwork. I think that's it, because breathwork moves lots of emotions in the body. If you're really doing it, if you're doing deep work, like you're actually breathing a lot and deeply, something's going to come up. Something's going to come up. Like, that's just how it works. You sounds like you've been facilitating this a lot, right? So you've probably seen a lot of stuff come up for not just yourself, but a lot of other people. And there's something about just like the embodiment piece of like psychology is downstream from biology.
Yep.
So to move the body, to get into the body, to breathe into the body is actually sort of like the way into the emotions and the mind and that kind of thing, right? So yeah, I think that's a really important tool. Man, you said something that there was another thread there that I really was interested in talking about. What was it? Anyways, so you've got this podcast, and you mentioned before we went live that you were curious about asking me some questions as well. And I've just been like kind of hogging the mic and asking you all the questions. So maybe I'll just pump the brakes on that for a second.
No, I've been enjoying this. I think, what am I curious about? I'm interested in, how do you feel like these explorations that you've been on, from psychedelics to sweat lodges, exploring this world, like how is that showing up in your day-to-day life, and how is it informing what you're looking to kind of dedicate your life to? Because that's a question that's very much alive for me at the moment as well. And I'm curious, like it seems like you're still very much in this like liminal space where there's just still lots of questions, there's still lots of like trying to map out the territory. But like what are some hunches that you have of like if you were to guess the type of work that you might be involved in like 5 or 10 years down the line, what comes to mind?
Yeah. Right now, the main thing that's alive for me is there's two main things, two projects. One is transformational wellness and building architecture that meets people where they're at and catalyzes the metamorphosis to a live player, orienting towards like maybe the infinite game. I like to just like find these little memes like live player and infinite game that I can kind of placeholder a whole lot of what I mean into like a little spot. Yeah. But basically that, just like transformational architecture.
Yep.
And so getting people to breathe, fundamentally like recalibrating, getting people back online, and the lungs are sort of like the whole bridge.
It seems like for me there's like the wellness piece and then there's the transformational piece. Like I think you have to get someone to a certain level to where like Bill Plotkin, like where the ego is sufficiently stable, they're sufficiently grounded, so that you can then go into the more transformational pieces, or you like build capacity in the beginning.
For sure,
that's how I view it.
Yep. So that's why I would say that. So transformational wellness to me would be like, what are the best levers we can pull to catalyze the process of healing, of self-discovery, and then ultimately just metamorphosis, like transformation by...
So you're like sending people into existential crises.
I mean, if they haven't integrated, if they have some sort of shadow work, well, we all have shadow work to integrate, but like if, they're, well, let me put it this way, like you meet people where they are. So it's not about like, hey, come through the door and go through like a hardcore initiation and die before you die. And, you need to take this heroic journey, heroic dose. It's more like, getting the foundation there. So like, breath is obviously the most fundamental aspect of life. Breath is life. And without breath, there's no life as a breathing mammal. So it's like, getting into how we breathe like we're supposed to breathe, and getting people into like transformative breathwork sessions where you can actually move some deeper shit with your breath, right? Figuring out how to prime the body with the breath, and figuring out how to downregulate and calm the nervous system with the breath. Like a lot of the stuff you're, way into is, what I think of as sort of a foundational aspect of wellness. It's like learning how to speak the language of the breath so that you can use breath for any aspect of life that you're in that you need it for, right? So if I'm in the sauna and I'm in the sweat lodge or whatever, I'm just, calming my body down, my mind down with slow breath, like long exhales, right? And, that's just one example, using it in a stressful situation when, you're like, think you're dying. So breath work and bringing people in line with breath is one pillar, I think, of wellness. You can look at like, I think another really strong lever is extreme heat and cold. I think just those external stimuli is sort of nature's natural medicine. And I think just so simple business model, breathe, plunge, and sweat, and do it together as a tribe, do it together as a community, and you're probably gonna be fine. Like that's a pretty solid foundation. And then maybe in the community space where you do that breath work, you can also do embodiment and movement and maybe some dance and
like
maybe
some sharing circle as well.
Yeah, all that, open mics. Maybe there's a psychedelic component if we figure out how to get the container right, like if we could do that without fucking it up. So like there's a lot that you can do. It's just simple architecture like that, and just some powerful levers, right? Like, so for me, I'm really curious about what would you build, right? Like what would you build if you were trying to catalyze a wave of cultural like a transformative wave of culture, right? And that leads me to this other project, which is Art Drop. So True North is my sort of, I've kind of, I guess at this point, committed to it being a bit of a wellness brand, like a transformational wellness brand. And that's, I think I'm going to build more. I have a float business. We do float tanks, sensory, people call it sensory deprivation, more like, I like to call it like flotation therapy. Because I don't think you're really deprived sensory. Like there's a whole lot going on. But like, so float tanks and cold plunge, sauna, breath or body work and whatnot, and some ketamine therapy with a clinic, and that's just sort of been my door opening into, wellness, and it's been a byproduct of my own journey, right? So it's just me. To bring it to your question, my experiences with psychedelics and my self-discovery journey and healing journey has led me to want to create better architecture and tools and open source some of these tools to the community, and in a way that hopefully can be more scalable. So that's one piece, and then I have this other component which I think is actually more important initially. Like I think we actually have to get I think art is actually one of the most psychoactive and powerful tools that we have to change culture. And in fact, if you were to look at like, hey, what's a culture? Like, what is your culture? You would look to what are our myths, memes, and metaphors. Those are sort of like at the bottom of the culture. And then the art that's expressed is sort of downstream from that. And it's sort of, it's sort of like it's kind of a projection of your cultural myths, right? And to the degree that it's really visionary art, it might be actually a new sort of story, right? And bringing in like something novel that's like a meme that is sort of looking to the future. right? That's not just perpetuation of whatever is in the current zeitgeist or whatever. So I think art as a kind of catalyst for cultural transformation and making a more beautiful world by painting it, by creating it in art first, right? Mm-hmm. And so obviously the medium of painting is a good example, but any medium of art and speaking can be an art form, so just like expression, I would just say art is authentic creative expression. So authentic creative expression seems to be like a really potent and powerful tool. So amplifying that signal, and there's this project Art Drop that I'm here in Colorado for, and it's like a startup, but basically trying to create a meme factory where you can actually manufacture protopian memes for a more beautiful world. You know what I mean?
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's kind of a way to liberate and democratize art. So I think of art itself, and then sort of like the art or the transformational sort of festival space as a way for art to be integrated into a collective, right? So you come and you listen to the music, or you listen to the speakers, or you get impressed on by the art, right? And there's like there's definitely this something about the festival container where it's kind of like this distinction between the sacred and the profane, right? And trying to create sacred space where you can come into some sort of like some sort of environment where where things can shift, and where deeper gnosis can be realized, and taking back the festival in a way, because it's just been super commodified, right, and turned into sort of like a profane thing, right, in lots of ways. That's kind of got a lot of negative aspects to it in many ways that you see it play out. Obviously, not all festivals are created equal, but so Art Drop would be kind of like the meme factory that also brings the art to the world by throwing events and by collaborating with people doing events and stuff. Those things have all kind of directly been a byproduct of my own self-discovery. And it's super weird, like with Art Drop, because I had a float, I call them visionary floats. I had a float assisted with some molecules, I'll say that, and came out and drew this piece of art. And I never make art. I've never had a painting practice or anything like that. But I came out and drew this seed of life, and it ended up being sort of this roadmap in a way. It was sort of this expression of this map towards, at the time, my true north. I was kind of drawing my North Star. And art was sort of the first step along the roadmap. And so to me, like, I'm focusing on art right now, but ultimately I want to build something like the eudaimonia machine, or like the eudaimonia center, or campus, or whatever scale you make it at. But it could just be as simple as communal space for gathering, for breathing, for moving, and then a cold plunge and a sauna. Like, maybe that's like the minimum viable product, right? Like, that's a super small version. And you could scale that all the way up into like whatever we can imagine, and just try to create transformational architecture oriented towards beauty and towards like wholeness and wellness, So those are, I don't know if I answered your question or if I just rambled.
Yeah, you did. That was beautiful. I just had I don't know if you've seen Neil Gaiman's commencement speech. It's called Make Good Art, and I really like, I mean, it sounds like everything you described is basically, it's a form of art. And I think of, breathwork is also an art in itself. It's like when I'm in the middle of a circle, it's almost like you're conducting an orchestra, and you just feel like moved by the field in some way. And so something that's actually really come from my experiences with the breath, with plant medicine, is this like reconnection to the sacred. And how for me, art is almost like sometimes it'll be like a totem, or it'll be like an artifact that comes back from that visionary space that then gets created. It's like a reminder or a reorientation back to that. And so whether it's a physical space, whether it's an online project, I think to the degree that these artifacts can be reminders or reorientations back to a kind of sacred appreciation of life, that then I think it's art, it's artistic. And the more that we can like conduct our own unique self symphony that Gaffney talks about, the more that we become these like instruments, these like hollow vessels for the sacred to kind of flow through.
Yeah. So the that's beautiful. The muse is sort of just kind of coming through you, and art would be like getting out of the way, or having the discipline to have a skill set in which it can come through.
Yeah.
Right.
Both.
Because I think the more that you dial in your capacity, the less noise there is, and the more you can channel the signal. Rick Rubin has a really dope book called The Creative Act.
I love it. I have it. It's like the modern day Dao De Ching.
Yeah, seriously, which is high praise. He deserves it. Like it really is. It's like a philosophical creator tome, where you just want to. It's like on the one hand, giving you like practically really good advice for just like the creative process, and on the other hand, it's just like profound insight into the nature of like cosmic creativity. So it's super beautiful, beautiful book. That's what was coming up while you're talking about that. Yeah. So what would be your form of art? Like, what are you authentically creating? Another way I like to ask that is kind of the Alan Watts way, which is like, what would you do if money were no object?
I mean, that question, like, I'm pretty sure I'd be doing the exact same thing that I'm doing now, maybe on a bigger scale. I think I'd probably get more resources, hire more people, kind of think on a bigger, longer time scale. I think that's probably the honest answer. But I'd still very much be doing what I'm doing now.
So what's that?
Teaching. It's not too dissimilar to what you shared, actually. It's creating containers for transformation, I guess, through doing a men's retreat in September. The main thing that I do is a course called Nervous System Mastery, which is a 5-week kind of cohort-based course teaching people embodiment principles, how to use the breath to self-regulate, how to build emotional fluidity, how to tune into our interoceptive faculties and listen to the data from our body that's kind of coming all the time. So I think I'm starting with a kind of almost like literacy piece, like teaching nervous system literacy and teaching some of the basic practices and protocols which can also create agency and like live players and give people more space between stimulus and response. There's many different ways to frame it, but I think it does really come down to agency and actually like invite people to become curious explorers of their own internal landscape. Like that's really what I'm hoping comes across, is like giving people enough initial experiences that they become intrinsically fascinated with their own internal experience and want to continue, whether it's breathwork, whether it's plant medicine in a good container, whether it's deep meditation. You know, there's so many different paths, and I think everyone has their own unique path. But what I'm trying to do is create, it's also a bit like a Trojan horse, where it's like bringing people in, meeting them where they're at, giving them a certain experience, and then kind of sharing more from there. Sneaking in the drugs later. Yeah, that's the righteous trickster that comes in at the end. So there's a lot of parallels with, I think, what, and I also would like to do more. I was kind of constrained by living in Bali and COVID, you know, working pretty much all online, but I'd like to do more in-person physical things also with hot and cold as well.
So what we need is a True North boulder with a 20-person cold plunge and a 20-person sauna and a 20-person gathering space.
That would be ideal.
Or maybe more people. I don't know.
That'd be ideal. I mean, we're thinking of getting a 5-person sauna here and a cold plunge as well.
Nice. That's a great start.
Yeah, starting small.
Yeah, that's a perfect start. And you could probably get a bunch of people come up and use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really rad. This is a perfect spot for it too. This place is fucking beautiful. Yeah, that's interesting. Like the drugs piece, you can totally just get high on your own supply with the breath work. You don't need to actually do the drugs. Breath is real medicine. Like it's the real.
And it's also a powerful like amplifier or downshifter during journeys as well.
For sure.
It's a very helpful tool.
Absolutely, you agree with that. So I got to ask you, what do you think of the float tank?
I have actually not had any great experiences in float tanks. I did do a couple of guided yoga nidras in tanks that were like an hour and a half long, and that was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
But I never quite I don't know, maybe it was just the tanks that I was in Bali, but I never quite dropped in. I would be curious to combine with certain aforementioned molecules in the tank. But yeah, it seems to me like I did spend 10 days in the darkness.
So what'd you think of that?
On a dark retreat. That was powerful. That was really powerful. And it was, yeah, I mean, just like the logistics of living. And after 6 to 7 days, there was this like DMT kind of white light that appeared as well, and started to see kind of subtle images. Yeah, that was a very powerful experience. And I do think there's a lot in, like, the more that we strip away the kind of external senses, the more we can tune into the internal ones. So I do love the concept.
Yeah, because you're talking about internal sciences, and I just have found that for me, my ultimate zone or like flow pocket where I can drop into, I guess, more of a meta awareness of my life, and also more of an embodied awareness of like my internal just space. Both, like from a physical sensory perspective, where am I holding pain? What is the nature of this pain? Where does this pain come from? You know what I mean? Like, how long have I been carrying this? Is this like mine? Does it belong to me? Like, what is all of this going on in here, right? And there's, like you said, terra incognita a couple times, and that to me is sort of like my first real, like, I had a couple of floats that were interesting. It was nice, but I didn't have any sort of like profound experience or anything like that. And then I went back to the tank because I kept hearing Joe Rogan, rant about it, and but he would say, like, edibles, and so I tried that, and did have, it wasn't just, I don't want to give the credit to edibles, because it was a catalyst, it was an amplifier, but really it was breath work. And I just gotten into Wim Hof breath at that period of time. So I just did like 5 rounds of like deep Wim Hof breath for, the beginning of my float with this edible. And it really like cracked something open, which gave me a new kind of awareness. And it felt like that terra incognita. It felt like I had just crossed the threshold into a new frontier of, say, consciousness. And I've been kind of exploring that ever since. And so for me, the float tank just seems to be like, not all floats are all about like getting us far out into like unexplored space. A lot of them are just about dropping in to find your center, right? To find your center, to feel grounded, to feel like oriented, like what am I orienting to in life, And so it's to sort of, in a way, detach from the current of the culture and all of the momentum in the world that kind of blows you around. And to sort of just have a space to find center. And then that's why I like the meme of True North. It's like, okay, now what's my North Star from here? What's the furthest I can see of where I'm trying to go to? And that's sort of the metaphor of my North Star. It's like, that's what's orienting me in a certain direction. And I don't know the details. I don't know how I'm going to get there. I just know it's that way. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so like, what is, so I'll segue with that. What's a North Star for you right now?
I think I've always been motivated by and admire acts of courageous curiosity. So I think that has been my North Star for, I'd say, the last kind of few years in this kind of experimental chapter of my life. But is that true today? What is my North Star? I mean, it's funny. We're talking on this land, and we've just moved into this new house yesterday, and I think that with this move has come questions of creating home, community, creating the conditions for a family in the coming years. And so I think like my North Star is at the moment is one of how can I cultivate trustworthiness kind of comes to mind, and integrity, to prepare for fatherhood, to prepare for that journey, and to really create a sense of like home and everything that comes with that, the community aspects, stewarding the land, creating the space inside. So I think like that's the true north exploration that is alive in me right now. Yeah.
We're aligned on that one, dude. I just got engaged, and
congrats.
Yeah, well, like I say, I'm milking it a little bit. I was probably a month ago.
That's pretty fresh.
Yeah. So that's been alive for me big time. It's like, okay, where's home? And I've always just sort of like kind of shortcutted my way around that question by just saying like, Earth is home. And I've actually embodied that, like done a lot of travel the last 5-6 years, and found my home in nature, you know, like in the rivers and in the forests and just in on the earth. Like, there's something that like really that shifted for me. And I think it was probably going to Colombia and doing ayahuasca and these sweat lodges and things, because not just because of the psychedelic experience of like, oh my God, like this is like, you know, if anyone who's had ayahuasca, it's like, it feels like something fundamentally like Gaia, or like I've gotten like sort of like a, I don't know what the right way to say it. I mean, plant teacher, you know, it's very plant, you know, nature oriented is what it feels like. And also mysterious and insane and crazy. But like mainly the sweat lodges too, and the cactus ceremonies, like it's all about reconnecting to this sense of the, you know, bringing the sacred back to the ordinary, like the trees and the water, the fire, you know, like and the animism of it, like speaking to these things like they're beings, and just all my relatives, thinking of them all as relatives, you know, and as relations. So since that sort of, you know, shifted for me, and I've always loved being outside and hiking in nature and stuff, but it really shifted for me in 2018 when I went through that initiation, that 10-day retreat. And for me, like now it's like, okay, which part of the earth, which one of these watersheds, which one of these ecosystems, which one of these canyons or mountains or whatever, you know, is the one that I'm going to try to like really get intimate with, right? And have intimacy with, right? Because there's something that you lose when, you know, there's something beautiful about traveling the world and seeing the diversity of the planet and culture, and just being in awe of, say, like, you know, Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, or, you know, like whatever it is, like some incredible, like Yosemite, like some incredible natural feature. And those are just in the US. I mean, these are all over the planet, right? You know, go swim the coral reefs and see the majesty of all that, right? Like there's so much to see and experience and people to meet. But if you don't ever just choose to like go deep on any one place or person, then you lose something there, which is like another kind of...
Yeah. I think it's like maybe it's similar to the diversive versus epistemic curiosity.
Yeah, very similar.
And I think like really taking the time to explore thoroughly in the beginning is really helpful. But then, as you say, if you don't ever choose and go deep, that there's like a freedom and a deeper intimacy that comes from depth. There's Martin Shaw, I don't know if you've come across his work. He says, be famous for 5 miles. And I love that idea of just like getting to know like a certain specific corner of the planet, and just getting to know it so intimately, like you would, you know, every crevice of your lover or your partner. Yeah,
and that also speaks to the nature of the transformation or the revolution or whatever you want to call it. Like if we were going to see shift in human consciousness and a reorientation of our social structures so that we can have like some sort of coherent, collaborative, coordination that we can do together, right? If we're going to do that, it seems to me, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe like the combination of AI and blockchain creates some sort of machine overlord that we bow down and we do what we're told, or whatever.
That sounds pretty dystopian to me.
Yeah. That's rough, right? Maybe not even bow down and do what we're told, but maybe it's just like I don't know. Like I don't know what's going to come out of this, but it seems like localization needs to be front and center, and that reconnecting to place and to community, and to having resilience, right? Like your food sourced locally and water stewarded and things of that nature seem to be like a really important part of the regenerative process, right? Like if we're going to come into like a regenerative culture where we can not just survive, but actually make the earth thrive more than it could without us, because we're kind of like pollinators if we want to be, right? Like we can be the caterpillars that are just eating everything, right? Growing as fast as possible. Or we can transform, into the pollinators that the ecosystem actually can't rely on. Like it has to rely on, it can't survive without. So I see localization being front and center of that. And so there's something drawing me into that of where am I going to go deep, right? And focus in and focus my energy. And maybe the answer is not to try to scale and make your business reach the whole planet, right? Or whatever. And maybe it's more just like do it as awesomely and as locally, like in your domain, do it as rad as possible and open source it as much as possible, so that like go take this to your community in Cleveland, you know what I mean? Or if whatever aspects of it that you like, right? And just try to make things easily accessible, because whatever is good for, me could probably be good for other people too.
Yeah. I think it's like find somewhere to love, like find a place to really love and to kind of dedicate yourself to, and again, kind of like trusting the process that comes from that. And that might be that you may end up creating something that does scale. Maybe it's like a new form of regenerative agriculture, like who knows. But I think it's more about, like, for me at least, it's like committing to the process and trusting that impulse within, and trusting whatever comes from that, not because I've like pre-imagined the end that will create. I think that's kind of one of the big fallacies that at least I'm trying to move away from, is this kind of like means to an end type thinking, and more just trusting in the process, and like you say, appreciating the like sacred in the mundane, in like the everyday moments.
So, seems like this is good a place as any. Yeah, if you're gonna fall in love with the place.
I hope so. Yeah,
it's a good place.
I hope so.
It's gorgeous. Do you have anything else that you're curious about, or that you wanna riff on before we wrap?
I'm curious about your van. Maybe we can check that out afterwards.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
No, man, this was great. This was fun. I feel like we covered a shit ton of ground. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always fun to go traipsing around in unexplored places with somebody.
It was a sign that it was a good podcast that you had to shift chair like 3 different times to avoid the sun.
I started at 12 o'clock. Now I'm at 6 o'clock. Yeah, I was just moving with the shade and the mic. Sorry for all the noise. But yeah, thanks, man. This has been a rad conversation. And Curious Humans is the name of your podcast. Where should people check you out, and if they're interested in your nervous system mastery or any retreats you're doing or anything like that, or just want to check out your podcast? Because you've had some really phenomenal conversations on there. I mean, like, guys like David White and Jamie Will and Charles Eisenstein, and I think you've had Zach Stein on there, and you just recently talked to Kevin Kelly. Like, you've had some really bomber guests on your podcast, and cool conversations. So I highly recommend people check it out.
Thank you. Yeah, it's funny that those guys feel like celebrities in our very small, like, microculture. The podcast is Curious Humans. The nervous system training is nsmastery.com, and that's the 5-week bootcamp that's starting in September. If people are curious, check that out. And then otherwise, just say hi on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter. The handle is Jonny Miller, but the I has a 1. And yeah, say hi.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Jonny.
Congrats if you made it to the end of this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I fucking enjoyed it. Ciao.